Donald Trump once again shifted his attention not to rivals, but to America's closest allies, the countries that have supported Washington for decades. This time, South Korea was targeted, a nation that fought alongside American troops, invested hundreds of billions in the United States, and only a few weeks ago signed a major trade agreement with Washington. Yet almost immediately after handshakes and loud praise, the Trump administration ordered an operation that resembled a military raid at the South Korean plant in Georgia. Armored vehicles and black SUVs entered the premises. ICE agents in full gear surrounded the Hyundai and LG facility. Nearly 500 workers were escorted out of the building, more than 300 of them South Korean citizens. They were lined up in front of cameras and treated like criminals. The ally found itself not honored, but humiliated on American soil. President Lee Jae-myung already warned that this raid would affect the trade deal. But the main question now is different. Why is Trump once again striking the countries that support the United States the most? Canada, European countries, Japan, and now South Korea. Nations that invest billions, open their markets, and trust Washington, but in return receive not respect, but punishment. What happened between Donald Trump and South Korea was far more than a trade spat. It was an example of how Washington pressures one of its most important partners in Asia, forcing Seoul to demonstrate loyalty even when the demands come from the country it relies on for security and economic growth. South Korea is not a secondary player. It is a frontline ally in the Pacific region and a major economic partner. Yet Trump treated it as if it were just another opponent in his tariff wars. In April, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports and 10% on aluminum under Section 232 of U.S. trade law, citing a national security threat. The contradiction was clear. A country hosting nearly 30,000 American troops and relying on the U.S. for defense against North Korea suddenly became a security threat simply for selling steel. For South Korean exporters shipping millions of tons to America each year, this was a stark warning. Access to a critical market could vanish overnight. To mitigate the blow, President Lee Jae-myung traveled to Washington in August 2025. Official photos showed smiles, but behind closed doors, Korean negotiators sought exemptions, while U.S. officials demanded concessions. Seoul had no choice. Korean industries, automobiles, electronics, batteries, critically depend on American consumers, and the U.S. market generates billions of dollars annually. The scale is enormous. In 2024, trade between the two countries reached $128 billion. South Korean exports fuel the American economy: batteries for electric vehicles in Georgia and Michigan, Samsung chips in U.S. data centers and defense systems. In return, America sells planes, energy, and agricultural products to Korea. Millions of jobs on both sides depend on these flows, now threatened by tariffs. Lee's visit and the September negotiations revealed how fragile the relationship had become. In South Korea, both business and society asked, why is an ally facing tariffs and visa raids as if it were an adversary? Under Biden, the focus was on cooperation in supply chains, but Trump turned tariffs into a first strike and offered relief only in exchange for new concessions. South Korea's role in the global economy raises the stakes even higher. Its manufacturing technologies sit at the center of both the American and Chinese systems. Samsung and SK Hynix semiconductors are everywhere, in iPhones, fighter jets, and data centers from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen. If Seoul leans toward Beijing, it could shift the balance of the global tech race. China, which aims to secure chip supplies, is actively attracting Korean companies with incentives and access to its market. Each time Washington increases pressure, Beijing presents itself as a more reliable partner. And it's not just about chips. In the electric vehicle sector, Korean giants LG Energy Solution, Samsung SDI, and SK On are building massive battery plants in the United States, on which Detroit depends. But if investors decide their money is safer in Asia, American factories will slow down, jobs will disappear, and the transition to green transportation will stall. Korea also leads in shipbuilding and shapes the global electronics market, from Samsung smartphones to household appliances. Losing access to these sectors would make the United States more dependent on expensive domestic production, or worse, on China. The risk is clear. If Seoul considers working with Beijing more reliable than partnering with Washington, America will lose a key link in its supply chains, and China will gain exactly the ally it seeks. Already in 2025, Beijing is actively deepening ties with Korea, presenting itself as a stable alternative amid Trump's fluctuations. Trump's strategy, instead of strengthening alliances, creates conditions under which one of the United States' most important allies may drift closer to its main rival. After South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's visit to Washington, where he stood alongside Donald Trump and expressed readiness to cooperate, one might have expected a pause, a breather to ease tensions. But the opposite occurred. Just a few days after the carefully arranged White House meeting, Koreans woke up to shocking headlines. U.S. immigration agents raided factories employing South Korean citizens. This was not a symbolic move or a quiet inspection. It was a full-scale operation. ICE officers entered the facilities, detained workers, and specifically singled out South Koreans, many of whom were directly involved in industries affected by the trade agreement that Lee had tried to protect in Washington. The timing was too obvious for Koreans. Their president had crossed the Pacific to strengthen cooperation with the United States, and just days later, his citizens were humiliated on American soil in front of cameras and journalists. What was supposed to symbolize a renewed partnership turned into public disgrace. The moment was the worst possible. On one hand, South Korea had made concessions on steel and automotive rules for the sake of stability. On the other hand, scarcely had Lee Jae-myung returned from Washington when U.S. immigration authorities began detaining Koreans in the United States. Among those detained were official LG employees, as well as contractors hired through third-party firms. Some had indeed overstayed their visas, but many were working under short-term permits, allowing 90 days of employment. This was not a crowd of hardened violators. The status of many was still under review. Yet all 475 people were detained in the same manner, treated like criminals. No distinction was made between those whose documents were in order and those who had violated the rules. A calmer, more targeted approach could have been taken, quietly notifying Seoul and reviewing each case individually. But the administration opted for a high-profile raid with armored vehicles, cameras, and tactical officers. Everything appeared designed not only to intimidate the workers, but also to send a global message. America's immigration campaign would affect even its closest allies. Away from the cameras, Washington and Seoul hurried to mitigate the consequences. Negotiators reached an informal agreement. The detained workers would not face trial and would simply be deported. To personally oversee the process, South Korea's foreign minister flew to Washington, organized the return of citizens, and began new negotiations on visa reforms intended to prevent a repeat of the crisis. But the damage had already been done. In the end, South Korea endured public humiliation, while the remedy came quietly and offered no reassurance that America remained a reliable partner. This distrust quickly extended beyond politics and diplomacy, reaching the offices where investment decisions are made. South Korea had promised to invest $350 billion in U.S. factories and projects, but those plans now hang by a thread. How can companies commit such sums to a country where their workers are paraded in front of cameras and treated like criminals? For global investors, stability and predictable rules are paramount, and the Georgia raid demonstrated the opposite. Even partners who have signed multi-billion-dollar deals can become victims of a political spectacle. If Seoul begins to hesitate and redirects its investments elsewhere, the consequences will extend far beyond the White House. American workers in states hosting Korean factories could lose promised jobs. Cities expecting new factories, housing, and contracts for local businesses could see those opportunities vanish. Entire sectors, from batteries and semiconductors to electronics, are now at risk. This story goes far beyond handshakes and press conferences. At its core are jobs, investments, and the fragile trust on which the global economy depends. When such trust is broken, recovery can take years, sometimes decades. Yet Trump continues to play, using allies as props for a political show as if there were no cost to pay. And the key question remains, if even loyal partners like South Korea can be humiliated on American soil, how long before other countries turn away for good? We will be watching this story unfold, So don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. See you in the next episode.